let's just get started here. We have a very special guest today here from Winnipeg?
Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada.
Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Who is one of the most foremost researchers, and you've seen him on Ancient Aliens, you've seen him on Hangar 1, UFO Files, and he's got a terrific book out called Managing Magic, which is one of the most, after 70 years, is probably one of the most insightful books on ufology and the problems with disclosure that's taken this long to be written. And Grant, we thank you for that. Our guest today is UFO researcher, author, lecturer Grant Cameron. Grant has been researching the UFO phenomena since 1975. He has lectured widely in Canada and the United States on the Canadian government's early investigations into flying saucers, UFO disclosure politics, and the presidential UFO connection. Most recently, Grant has teamed up with Paul Robinson to develop a website about the connection between Hillary Clinton and UFOs. Mr. Cameron has been featured on History Channel's Ancient Aliens television program, as well as Hangar 1, the UFO Files, and he has recently published perhaps the most extraordinary book about UFO disclosure politics called Managing Magic. And I'm sure he has even more exciting things to share with us today. Grant?
Okay. I'm from the coldest major city of the world, and I see this many people here, and I'm sure Dustin, my assistant, will agree. We just can't figure out why people would be here wasting their time watching me when you've got such lovely weather. And in Winnipeg, we would have an excuse. What I'm going to talk about today, I'll give you just sort of a basic thing of my history. I have the sightings in 1975, 1976. I followed the edge of the earth. I try to get a manuscript published. Nobody wants to publish the manuscript. And I say, okay, sightings is a total waste of time, which I still sort of think. And I know this is for real. I was up close the first two times, very close. It was not a light in the sky. So I said, well, nobody wants to publish the manuscript. And all I'm interested in now is, what did I see? Somebody in the world has to know what I saw. Somebody's got to know what's going on. So I started this search of trying to figure out who had the answer. Synchronistically, a guy who worked in my father's office, my father was a pilot for the Canadian government, a radar tech, actually worked for the Canadian UFO program. Right? And there they call it flying saucers. They never used the word UFO. Flying saucer program. He said, if you want to know what's going on with UFOs, you should know what the Canadian government is doing. So I go on this pursuit where I gather all the files of the guy who ran the Canadian government UFO program from 1950 and 1954. We kept very secret the fact that this guy was an experiencer. He was actually interacting with this alien by the name of Alpha. So I went there, I got all his files, I talked to his wife. He had been dead since '62, I didn't get there till '77. Started that pursuit, and then the Canadians were told by the Americans in September of 1950 that mental phenomena was involved in the UFO mystery. And the key to that is that nobody in 1950 was talking to aliens, ETs, whatever you want to call them. There was nobody. It was just UFOs flying around. There was no, Adamski would not appear until a couple of days after the detonation of the hydrogen bomb. There was nobody talking to aliens. So the question was, how do the Americans know to tell the Canadians that mental phenomena was involved? Later on, my whole career would be flipped. So I go from the Canadian government, I'm trying to find out who in the American government told the Canadians. That led me to a guy by the name of Dr. Eric Walker, who was a former president of Penn State University, had 14 honorary doctorate degrees, was chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, the top military think tank in the United States. Chased him around for 8 years, and he said the same thing when we asked him about MJ-12, which I've got some new information if someone wants to ask a question later. I got some new information on MJ-12. When we were asking about MJ-12, is it still an American group? Is it still just 12 people? He said, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? And that was another indicator that led me to where I sort of really flipped off the edge of the earth in 2012. I go from Walker, and Walker was going to send his files to the Truman Library. So I went to the Truman Library looking for Walker's files, and it was at that point, I remember back to 1975, I'm trying to figure out what is this mystery that I saw. Somebody's got to know, and I figured, well, President of the United States has got to know what's going on. I mean, he's the most powerful guy in the world, supposedly. And so then I asked the Truman Library, I said, well, what do you got on your UFOs with the President? And they basically had a bunch of telegrams in 1952, if you remember. There was a bunch of UFOs flying over the White House and over Congress and stuff, and the President had given a shoot-down order. And a week later, they came back. And during that week, the newspapers on the front page of the newspapers all had, President gives a shoot-down order. And a bunch of people were sending telegrams into the President saying, don't shoot him down, Mr. President. And there was a story even told by Frank Edwards, who was probably the sort of the Art Bell of the 1950s. He had 10 million people on Mutual radio, and he said that he had talked to Einstein, and that Einstein had actually told the President, Mr. President, anybody that can come across millions of miles of space will know what to do to protect themselves once they get here. Mr. President, don't start something you can't finish. And according to Edwards, he said it was the first time give him hell, Harry decided it would be better not to give him any hell. So basically, all I had was these telegrams that had been sent into the President. I got these telegrams, and then the Eisenhower Library was just down the road, and then I went to the Eisenhower Library and I asked the same question. I said, what have you got on the UFOs and the President? And they had 5 documents. One was the famous CIA Robertson panel report, which was done under Truman, but actually didn't end up until it wasn't processed until the Eisenhower administration, so it's in the Eisenhower Library. They had 5 documents. I said, well, how many pages of documents have you got? He said, 28 million. And it was at that point I go, something's wrong here. 5 documents and 28 million. And because I consider it the most important subject, and I would think the government would consider this to be a very important subject. So this is just a background of how I got dragged into this whole thing. So I'm chasing the President, and in the end I determined the President is brief. The President knows what's going on. The President is the Wizard of Oz. They want you to think there's some dark cabal running the show, because they're going to send you down some dark alley, and you're never going to find it because it's actually the President that's running the whole thing, and they want this plausible deniability. So I got to that point, and it really, in the end, I came to the conclusion, it really doesn't matter what they do. All that matters is what I do. So whether they're doing this or they're doing that, it really doesn't matter, because the President's really not going to, whether he knows or whether he doesn't know, he's not going to tell you. End of the story. So it really doesn't matter whether he knows or doesn't know. 2012, I'm watching a lecture by Colin Andrews, and this is where I lost a lot of support in the UFO community. I won the Researcher of the Year award at UFO Congress. I don't think I would win it again if they'd known what was about to happen. But I'm in a lecture by Colin Andrews, and there's a mention here that Bob Brown is now doing another conference. He's back in the business again. This is Bob Brown who's running these conferences, and they went for 8 days, UFO Congress, and this was in Laughlin, Nevada. And I'm there, and when the thing goes for 8 days, and it goes from 8 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, you don't go to everything. You just sort of pick and choose. So you go, oh, okay, we're going to go for lunch, we're going to walk around, I don't like this lecture, I'm going to go to this lecture. And there's no two tracks. It's not like Contact in the Desert where they got 4 people at the same time and you're trying to figure out, well, you know, which one am I going to go to? It was one track, so it was always the same. So Colin Andrews is giving a lecture, and I'm very sort of specific in what I research. I'm really not into crop circles. I don't care about crop circles. It's not that they're not interesting, they're not important or whatever, but I really wasn't interested in crop circles, and yet Colin Andrews was the guy who came up with the term crop circles, and I knew he was a very famous researcher, so I decided I should go and watch him. I should pay respect to this guy. I should go watch his lecture. So I went into the lecture, and it came to this idea of what I wrote a book called Inspired, The Paranormal World of Creativity. I'm in there, and what happens is I zone out, which some of you may have an inspiration here today if you zone out when I'm talking. And so I zone out. I don't really want to be there. I'm really not interested in crop circles. I'm listening to him. He's talking about crop circles and consciousness, the idea that 20% are real, they're created by the phenomena, 80% are hoaxed, and they're also created by the phenomena. So the phenomena is telling the hoaxers what to put down. This was his whole lecture. So I'm listening to this lecture, and all of a sudden, boom, this stuff comes into my head instantaneously. And it was, the number one thing was this 1950 document that the Canadians have been told mental phenomena is involved. Dr. Eric Walker saying to us in 1991, what do you know about ESP? And Jan Hartson's 1993 lecture, where Jan Hartson says, he talked to Ben Rich. And as Ben Rich is leaving the building, he said, Ben, I need to know, how do they get here? How does the propulsion system work? And Ben turns around and says, let me ask you a question. What do you know about ESP? Exactly what Walker had said 2 years before. So it was these things came into my head, and I suddenly realized, like, oh, this is it. It's consciousness. At first I thought it was consciousness, and then later I realized, no, it was non-local, the importance of non-local consciousness. So This is what I'm sort of going to get a little bit into today, is this consciousness thing, and it's starting to move. In 2012, when I had the download, I remember Jerry Pippin, if you remember the famous podcaster Jerry Pippin, and I was good friends with him. And I remember him actually doing an interview with me. He was dying, he was in the hospital, he was actually in his bed, and he was doing it on a cell phone, and he was like near death, and he said, and I said, I give you appreciation that you would actually do this, like right to the very end. He said, well, what else do you want me to do? Should I go into the park and play tiddly, and whatever this game that they play in the park, the hammer was, this is what I'm doing till I die. And one of the last interviews he ever did was me. He was like, he's near death in the hospital bed. He said to me, he said, Grant, I can't believe you've done this. I can't believe you've gone from the nuts and bolts to the woo-woo side. And I went, well, Jerry, I'll tell you what, I didn't actually plan to go there. I was sort of teleported there. And so I sort of fell off the edge of the earth with this consciousness thing, and a lot of people have sort of said, oh, I lost my mind, this is crazy stuff. And now you're seeing it starting to move. People are starting to use the word. John Burroughs is starting to talk about it. And now actually at the MUFON conference in this year in Irvine, they're going to bring it up. Jan Hartson actually gave a lecture on consciousness a couple weeks ago in Laughlin. So this is sort of where this is sort of going, and there's some of these weird sort of aspects of consciousness I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to, and I'll leave it to people for questions that they want, because a lot of people are into To the Stars, and as was mentioned, I wrote the book Managing Magic, and that was written before Tom DeLonge came public, and I've got about 75 pages on him. I knew about Tom DeLonge before he went public, and I have this whole thing about messiahs, and the idea that it's worked this way all through history, that I was involved with Bill Moore in the 1980s. I was involved with Robert and Ryan Wood in the 1990s when they leaked 3,700 pages of documents. Bill Moore, they were leaking documents to him. And I was also involved with Robert Emmenegger's famous documentary guy, he was a gray advertising vice president in Los Angeles, who had done the famous documentary called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. And you can actually find it if you Google search it, UFOs That Has Begun. This is the one where the U.S. dropped a bunch of material into a documentary, and that it had given him this material. So I was involved with Emmenegger in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and so when Tom DeLonge came forward, I went, oh, they're doing it again. It's exactly. In fact, a lot of the people that are in the Tom DeLonge operation were in the Bill Moore operation. It's the same people. And it's not that they're bad guys, it's these guys who are high-level former military intelligence guys who are just, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And as soon as the government opens a door where they've got somebody who's going to carry the message, they all jump in because they know there's going to be money and there's going to be conversations, and they're trying to figure this thing's going on. So anybody wants to ask questions about To the Stars, they sort of watch what I'm doing. They watch what I'm doing. And they've been a little bit critical about what I've got, and I've said, okay, point out what I've got wrong, and I'm going to change it. I have no problem changing what I've said. And so if you've got any questions about that, so it starts, my lecture day starts with the latest thing that they're doing. This is the ATOM program, if you're familiar. They got a program now where they are looking at metals. And they have got, they say 7 pieces. There was just a lecture that Lou Elizondo gave in Italy where he shows them on a screen. And on the screen there's actually about 11 pieces of metal. 10 or 11 pieces of metal. And I've been involved, because the Canadians were involved in metal, so I've been involved with metal. Now I can't show you, I've got photographs, but I've actually got some metal. And so the metal is the same sort of thing. It's like UFO sightings. You're going to get a lot of UFO sightings, and if you have one yourself, as I did, and that's my problem, is that when I saw it, it was up pretty close. So I've never ever tried to prove that UFOs exist. I know UFOs exist, I don't really care. I'm not trying to prove to you, I know what I saw. I'm trying to figure out what's actually going on. What is this phenomenon? So the same thing happens with metals, is what's going to happen, this is my prediction. They're going to get this metal, and apparently they've got one piece already, I've heard, that is going to be confirmed that it is not from around here. But you can't really prove that. It's always this dead end. Because you can always say, well, you know, there's a cabal that created this, there's black ops that created this, there's always going to be an out. So it's going to be very, very weird. They've got supposedly the one piece, and they've got some pieces that I thought they were going to confirm as being real. The one was a friend of mine who told me when I started talking to him, he said, oh, you missed this one, and he gives, it's this piece that, this orb is flying by his house, and it's off the ground, and it's dripping this metal. And he's saying, oh, it's not ejected metal, it's dripping metal. And it was dripping on the driveway, this ore, it's flying along dripping this. And he grabs this metal, and apparently they've said it's nothing unusual, which was kind of weird, because it's a very unusual story, this ore dripping metal. So they've got a lot of these various pieces. And then Desta and I actually found one here at the University of Arizona. And I'll talk about that a bit. But this is sort of like a dead-end road. So it's going to prove, almost like the UFO photographs or like the videos, if you've seen the videos that were released last December, everybody's going to go like, wow, that can't be from around here. But in terms of telling you what it is and where it's going, it's really not going to go any farther than that. It's just going to prove that there's something going on and it's probably not from around here. That's why I've moved past that and I've said, what's actually going on? And I've gotten into this inspiration thing. So I wrote a book called Inspired. I wrote a book called Tuned In, which I've got here, which goes into this aspect that some people are able to get into the field, whatever the field is. They're able to shut down the conscious mind, pop into the field, and pull stuff back. And I've got Nobel Prize winners. I've got all the inventions that you wouldn't believe, some of the stuff that came in dreams and stuff like that. And then my assistant Desta has a book that we have here too, and she's the same sort of thing. So I use a different method. I walk about 10 miles a day. That's the way and all I worry about is one thing when I walk. I think about what am I here for and what am I supposed to be doing. That's all I think about. And it's to put that whole thing, I really don't care what happens in the outside world. So I'm going through that, and that's how I can pop into the field. And I've had a number of incidents where I have popped in, where I've been able, the stuff suddenly starts to flow out of the field. Now Desta does a different type of channeling thing, and she's got a book where, and I'll actually ask her questions, ask them this, ask them that. Because the idea is, if you can get somebody in the field, if somebody can tap into that field and pull material back, why would you not talk to them? Why would you not ask questions? Let's take all the, one person called it hacking the field, where if a bunch of you say that you're in the field, then I'll talk to all of you and I'll say, okay, ask them, what's the best way to purify water? And there's actually been an experiment where they got 18 people and they asked each of them, what's the best way to purify water? And out of the field, these people are giving them ideas. So you compare the ideas, and maybe you're going to get 3 or 4 that will confirm something we don't know about how do you purify water, things like this. So to me, the field is the most important thing, it's getting in there. And I also believe that we're getting help, and I'll mention this a bit in the lecture. They're actually giving us material. People are being fed material, whether it's from spirits or aliens or whatever, I just call it sort of the field. So, and I'll start with this, the Tao Te Ching, the 76th verse, I'll start with this, just to sort of give a heads up on how I work. It says, a man is born gentle and weak, at his death he is hard and stiff. Green plants are tender and filled with sap. At their death they are withered and dried. Therefore the stiff and unbending is the discipline of death. The gentle and yielding is the disciple of life. Thus an army without flexibility never wins a battle. A tree that is unbending is easily broken. The hard and strong will fall, the soft and weak will overcome. For me, that says that what I say today is what I say today. It may not be what I'm going to say on Tuesday, because that means that if I say it's going to be the same thing on Tuesday, that means whatever happens Monday, I'm not going to pay any attention. I'm very flexible. That's why I said to Tom DeLong when he put out this tweet about the fact that I've got everything wrong and I have to correct this stuff, I said, whatever, tell me what's wrong. I'll change it. So my thing is always to stay very flexible in terms of what's happening, what I believe, and that I'm very willing to change at any point. Now these metals you've seen, is everybody familiar with the Atom program, with all this metal thing? They're trying to get this metal. And what they've done, the main piece that they've got that is very, very strange is this, it's a layered piece, and it's called Apports. Linda Howe had this piece since 1996. And it's a piece that's bismuth magnesium, and it's layered, thick, thin, thick, and they're basically saying we cannot build this piece. We have no ability. It's like it's put down one atom at a time, which I says, this is probably how it actually works. It's like if you take a cell, a human cell that duplicates itself, you say, oh, it's just duplicating the cell. It's called naming theory. You give it a name and make it go away. You say, oh, it's just duplicating. Take a cell, and that cell will duplicate a second cell, and there's 100 trillion atoms in that second cell. So that first cell has to take 100 trillion atoms, it has to source them, it has to find these 100 trillion atoms, and it has to take the atoms and put them in the right three-dimensional spot, and it'll do it in 16 hours. And that next cell will be able to duplicate itself and have all the knowledge of the first cell until a human body has 80 or 100 trillion cells. So it's this process, and it's almost like this metal is like it's being grown, like it's something else. It's like a system is putting the metal down. It's not that you're actually doing it manually. So this is the main piece they've got. It's this piece that it was off a wedge-shaped craft, claiming from the 1940s. Now, nobody can prove where it came from. The thing with this metal is, I have a theory that, and if you've seen it, it's called the theory of wow, where basically I come up with this idea that maybe there's not anything going on at all. Maybe the intelligence behind the phenomena, it's like a science fair project. And what they're trying to do is just to get you to go, wow. So the grade 1 class just says, let's put lights on the craft. And they fly around and you go, oh, wow, what's going on? And this is the whole idea. Why do UFOs have lights on them? So you can see them. They want you to see them. When you see a UFO, you're part of the game. If they want to cloak themselves, if they want to disappear, they can disappear. When they are appearing, they want you to see them. And so the grade 2 class would be crop circles, the grade 3 would be this, whatever. And they would just go through these sort of things. And I said grade 6 would be the metals. Let's drop a piece of metal down that's very weird. And they're going to pick up the metal and they're going to go, ooh, this is pretty weird. What is this? And it makes you think. Because if you come in and I say to you, okay, I'm here to bring you freedom, democracy, Jesus, and McDonald's, next thing you're pointing a gun at me and saying, get the hell out of here. You're disturbing me. If you get the person to make that decision themselves, where you give them the breadcrumb and they go, oh, I think I figured it out, then it's solid in their head. Then you bring them over rather than confronting a person face to face and saying, you're wrong. And that's what I think with the metals. Because one of the things about the metals, and there is probably, I would know of 20 pieces of metal that have been around. And what you see with the metal, the first thing that struck me, and that's where I got this theory of wow, was there's no two pieces of metal that are the same. They're all different. So you say, what's the chances, if you're got flying saucers, that all of them are using different metals? And like some are, I'll give you an example. The one Desta found, she actually found the file. And it was just as we were ready to leave, she finds this file. And James Mcdonald, Dr. James Mcdonald, here at the University of Arizona at Tucson, had this huge collection of files. So we're there only for about 3 hours, so we got these boxes, and I call for the different boxes. And Desta finds one on metals. So it pulls this thing, and it's, at that time, James McDonald didn't know what this was about. It was just this weird piece of metal. They used to have a NASA facility here when they were going to the moon in Tucson. And this woman had this piece of metal, and it occurred in 1939 in Illinois. Her father was sitting there, and all of a sudden, it was at night, there was like a flash, like a lightning bolt coming out of the sky towards the garden, and he went to look. And here was this piece of metal that had been embedded into the garden. And it was red hot. He couldn't touch it. It was red hot. So as soon as it cooled down, he took a knife and he dug this thing out of the garden. And then he gives it to the daughter in well, I don't know what year he gave it, but it happened in 1939. So in 1967, she comes to the University of Arizona here, and she gives it to, she goes to this facility that's doing the aerospace stuff, and says, what is this thing? And then they bring it to James McDonald, and it was passed around to a bunch of people at the University of Arizona trying to figure out what this piece is. Now what it's called is, this is called ejected metal, and there's a lot of these cases. The first one actually occurred before the first UFO sighting. The first UFO sighting that's notoriously talked about is Kenneth Arnold, June the 24th, 1947. This occurred 3 days before. This is Maury Island. If you remember the story about Maury Island, and everybody said, oh, this thing's a hoax, whatever. Now you start looking back, and it's the same story, and you start thinking, yeah, this thing was for real. This probably story actually happened. What it was, they were on this boat, and this thing comes along, these 3 UFOs, and all of a sudden, the one starts raining down this metal on them, and falling down, and it killed a dog. One guy's arm was injured. The boat was all sort of full of this stuff. The U.S. Air Force actually flew in, grabbed a bunch of this metal, and flew back out and crashed. And that was the first big conspiracy theory, was that these guys crashed coming out of there with this metal going back. And so these stories go back a long time. And you get all of them. There was one in Brazil where the UFO is flying at these people on the beach, and all of a sudden, boom, and it explodes, and all this metal comes raining down on these people. And the whole question is, if it's some advanced technology, they come all the way across the galaxy and then they start to fall apart. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Or they come and they crash at Roswell, New Mexico, and everybody knows the technology that this phenomena has. It can shut down everything. It can shut down your mind. It can shut down anything. So why would they not go back to Roswell, New Mexico and recover the craft? If it crashed, they could recover the craft. Why would they allow us have all these crashes and allow us to recover these crashes? So maybe it's grade 6 project. They just want you to have this metal because it's all different, and a lot of it is extruded metal. Or like my friend, he has the UFO flying and is dripping this metal, and he's watching this thing and is dripping this metal down. It wants him to pick up the metal, and he scrapes the metal off his driveway, and to the stars, I will guarantee you, they analyze this material. So you have these various pieces, and we had the one and it's a very bizarre sort of piece. I've got it on my Facebook site, if you know how to find my Facebook site. It looks like a spike that you would put in a garden. It has this sort of bubbly top on it. And when they had it, they just said it was very unusual. It was 99% nickel. In 1967, they said there was no machine parts or nothing that was made out of that purity of nickel. It didn't make any sense why it was so pure. And so the art parts piece is bismuth, magnesium. There's one that is called the Bob White piece, 1985. Bob White is a guy, he's going to Las Vegas. He's coming along the Colorado-Utah border. He's just crossing over the border. There's a UFO. He shines a light at the UFO and then shoots this metal at him. And again, it was red hot. He picks up this metal, and this piece has been around for quite a while, and it's almost pure aluminum, very high aluminum. That is the way it was formed. That you couldn't have heated this thing. So it has these weird things where you're going like, how do they do this? How do they actually create this type of metal? And the one at University of Arizona, they had no idea. They had no idea how they could actually make this kind of metal and why it was in this form. So that's what I think a lot of the stuff is, that they're sort of bringing this stuff out and they're letting us see this. Jacques Vallée is one of the main people that's involved, and a guy out of Stanford University by the name of Gary Nolan. And Vallée has a whole collection of this material. The same thing is, you know, the implants, and the abductees talk about they have the implant. I've talked to people who have dealt with implants, and first question, because now I got this theory of wow. So I say, you dealt with all these implants. Are any two the same? And I go, no, they're all different. And it's the same thing. It's like, it's almost like if it was a technology, if it was a set technology, there would be a same one found here as found there. And it's almost like the UFO sightings. They're almost always different. They're all different UFO sightings. And we had in 1890s, we had ships with propellers, wooden ships with propellers and guys hanging off ropes. And then in 1943, it was the Foo Fighters, little balls of light off the edge of the plane, and then it turned to green fireballs, and then it was the Adamski crafts with the big balls underneath, and then it was classic flying saucers, now it's triangles, and it's almost like they're just saying, let's just change it, okay, change it, and you're moving through, and we think it's always the same. But as I always say, I've been in this since before Jesus was a carpenter, and I can tell you what happened in 1975 does not happen now. It was a completely different world. There was no crop circles, there was really no abductions. Travis Walton was abducted a few months after I had my sighting. But basically, what's happening now with the missing time, that didn't exist. Nobody knew about that. Nobody knew about crop circles. Nobody knew about people who can speak these alien languages and stuff like that. None of that stuff was going on. It was just straight UFO sightings. And that was the problem with the Mcdonald's files. His was the 60s and the early 70s, his files, and it's basically just straight stuff. You can see there's no weird stuff in there. It's just UFO sightings. So this metal thing, I even got a piece. I was given a piece that was taken out of a place in New Mexico, and then my friend gave it to me. He said, "Oh, you could have it." And then suddenly, about a week later, he said, "Can I have my piece back?" And then he suddenly realized what he'd given away, and he said, "You can cut off a little piece." So I cut off a little piece. I'm really not that big, but I actually have a piece myself. Then you have the one with the orb thing, and it's a pretty bizarre. There's a pretty bizarre photograph. Maybe I'll leave it on after. If there's a break, is there a break at some point?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll leave this screen. You can come take a look at this photo. It's a very bizarre photo. This is the same guy that had the orb and the metal. And this is a guy that I can guarantee you is watched by the U.S. Defense Department, by the U.S. Air Force, by intelligence, by the White House, by everybody's watching Sky, because you've got this very high level of contact. And this makes sense. If you've got somebody with a very high level of contact, why would you not talk to the person and say, how do you do this? I mean, who are they from? And ask them questions. Now you could say maybe they're lying or whatever, but there are, if you look at the free survey, which takes a look at the experiencers, there's 4,500 experiencers now who have spent 5 or 6 hours filling out a survey as to their experience. And you can, if you give them a lie detector test, that's fine. If you get 10% that seem to be legitimate, why would you not? It's the old idea of hacking the field, that these people are walking around, 42% of all experiencers say they're walking around with mathematical, technical, or scientific material in their head that they did not learn in school. Now, it may not mean anything to you, but when I had 2 major download experiences, when this suddenly came into my head, I go, oh, I know what that's about. And it's the idea that the material that's coming, and when I did my book Inspired, I don't have it here, but in my book Inspired, I do a whole chapter on savants. And these are people that you may have met, a savant or a highly autistic person or whatever. I worked with them, and I didn't realize how important these people were, because they used to give me these people to work, because they'd be in grade 12 and they couldn't do their regular stuff. They sent them to the university where I was working, and I ran all the cleaning staff and all the, outside people and all this sort of stuff. And they'd bring them to work. And these people, what I learned from these people is that if, for example, you get these, where they were called the Sachs twins, as an example. And they'd be sitting in a chair, and they'd be rocking back and forth. And the guy would say, okay, in the year 93,343, on July the 11th, what date is that? And you'd go, oh, that'd be a Tuesday. And dead on. And they're always, it's not 2 out of 3, they're always right. And then he'd say, okay, the year 133,000, whatever, July the 11th, and he'd go, oh, that would be a Saturday. Dead on. And then they would ask him, okay, you think, okay, the kid's just calculating. And he'd say, okay, so what's 4 times 7? And the kid goes, I don't know. And then he'd say, come on, we taught you, where did we teach you? And the kid would say, okay, on the 5th floor, 1963, in this ward, and he's naming exactly where it was. And he said, okay, so you remember being taught this? Yes. So what's 7 times 4? And he goes, 21? And he goes, could be more? And the kid goes, yeah, could be more. So he's not calculating, he's pulling it out of a field. And you can see this over and over again, that especially these savants. You can give them multiple numbers, and they're never wrong. They'll pull it. And I believe the same thing's happening with legitimate experiencers, that they are somehow pulling material out of the field. So this one guy, very high level, and I'll leave this photo up because it's really weird. They started to make this sort of a contact, and they have this thing appears in a garage, and it's a very, very bizarre photo. 52, the Canadians were working on it. The Michalak, I'm from Manitoba, and the most famous case that ever occurred around me was Stephen Michalak case. It occurs about 60 miles out of my home. This is the one where this guy's a prospector, and he's in this sort of a forested area with a lot of rocks, this Cambrian shield, and he's doing prospecting, and all of a sudden he hears all the geese stop. And he's looking around, and he's trying to figure out what's going on, and this UFO lands on this big, huge rock in the middle of this clearing. And it lands, and the door opens up, and he goes up to this thing, and he looks in, and he says, hey, you got many Americans, come on out. And then he tries Russian, because he's a Polish guy. He tries Russian, Polish, he knows all these languages. And he's yelling inside this craft, and you can see this light, these sort of bars in there, but you can't see anybody inside the craft. And then he backs up, and the door shuts, and this thing starts to move. It starts to twirl as it's leaving, and there's a vent. And this vent burns his shirt. It's very famous. His shirt starts on fire, and he gets this embedded pattern that will appear and reappear. It'll go away. After a couple of years, it was the Mayo Clinic in Minneapolis, and then he'd come back, and then the thing would reappear after a couple of years. Very famous case. Blue Book looked at this case. It was a definite unknown. What we learned later was that there was metal at that site as well, that in the cracks of this metal, it was silver. So you have the one we had the other day was nickel, you have the Apports, which is magnesium bismuth, and then this is silver, and it's like the same thing. And Rendlesham Forest, the famous Rendlesham Forest, there's now reports that they have shavings from Rendlesham Forest. There was metal at Rendlesham Forest as well. And it's almost like every time you do a big event and you want some publicity, you drop some metal. Because people take the metal and go, oh, that's pretty cool, what is this? And so, let me just go through. And then I'll give you one of the most famous ones. Because there's lots of people getting these parts. There's a story, if you know, John Lennon had a UFO sighting in August 1974, and May Pang was with him, and they tell the whole story about how the Oz effect and all the people seem to be missing out of the houses, and time slowed down and all that kind of stuff. The next story that was told it's told by Uri Geller. And Uri Geller tells the story that John, he lived in New York City near John there, and they used to go for coffee in the back of this restaurant. And he tells the story that John Lennon told him, that wasn't his only UFO encounter. The other one that happened, he woke up in the middle of the night, Yoko Ono is with him, and he can't wake up Yoko Ono, she's sort of like comatose, and he sees light coming in from under the door, he thinks there's a fire in the hallway, in the condo, he's up on the penthouse area, he thinks there's, and you can see light coming through the doorknob, the key thing, and all this sort of stuff, and he's going, wow. So he goes to the door, and he opens up the door, and he said there was these effing bug creatures standing there, looking at him. And so he went to attack them, to force them back, and with their mind, they forced him back. And the next thing, he wakes up, and now he's on top of the covers in the morning. Yoko Ono's awake, and he's got this thing in his hand. It looks like a little egg, like a little bronze egg. And he's holding this little egg in his hand. And again, it's this metal thing. He's been given this piece of metal. So he goes to Uri Geller, and he wants to have coffee with him, and he says to Uri, he says, I want you to have this. He said, he tells the whole story, and he said, this may be my ticket to another planet, but I don't want anything to do with it. You keep it. So I went to Uri and I actually confirmed with him, do you have this thing? Because they had offered to analyze this thing, and Uri never wanted to let it out of his possession. He told me the same story he told these investigators, was he said, it's on my possession at all times. I have this with me, wherever I go, it's with me. And he said, I've never wanted to have it analyzed because I was always afraid it might be made in Taiwan. So, so you have these stories with very famous people. Now the other thing I want to talk about today, and this is this thing about this consciousness thing. And what I want to try to make the point today is that when you look at these type of phenomena, you have to realize that you're part of the phenomena. That people will think it's a separate event, that I'm here, the event is there. And I think what I'm making the point is, and I think more and more people are coming to this conclusion, is that you're part of it, that you cannot keep yourself out. And it comes to this whole thing with the Skinwalker Ranch. If you've seen the latest movie just came out about the Skinwalker Ranch, and they talk about all this bizarre stuff, this big giant wolves coming, bigger than, you know, SUVs and stuff like that, and all this sort of, and they painted as this sort of very sort of negative phenomena. And because I've been involved with experiencers so much, I suddenly realized there's sort of a problem with this sort of story, is that if you get at Skinwalker Ranch, it's sort of very negative, but there's a lot of people doing the same thing, and they don't have the same experience. And the other thing that was involved with Skinwalker Ranch, I was talking about, this is where this bizarre event occurred, where Trish and I and Justin, everybody was there. They saw part of it. I'm going to tell you this whole story about these Apports. From time to time I get this thing, and I know when something's coming, when there's something they want, or whoever, it's sort of like you get into this sort of a synchronistic loop where everything that happens is like, go, go, go. And things are popping into place. So I got this thing about Apports. Now to find you, I didn't even know what an Apport was, or an Apport, whatever people want to pronounce it. I had no idea what these things were. And I was first talked to about by Ray Hernandez, who runs this big free survey. And he's talking about a guy, he said the most dramatic experiencer he has, I think the guy's name is Fernando, in Miami. And he said this guy, all this stuff, and he talks about this happening, this happens, this happens. And he has these Apports. He has these things that fall out of the sky. He'd be in a room, and something will fall down. And he's got a collection of these things. He's got a whole collection of all these different things that have fallen into the room. And I said, because I knew they were doing, the Atom Project was doing the metals, I said, Ray, you know, this is just a story. This is this guy's story. If we could get one of these things analyzed, and it actually shows us something very weird about it, then it actually justifies the fact that this guy is actually this experiencer and this stuff's happening. He still hasn't agreed to do the interview or to analyze the thing. So these Apport things happen. I suddenly realized they happen all the time. And one very famous story was told, goes right back to when the remote viewing program started in the 1970s. There's a story told by Edgar Mitchell was there, the Apollo 14 astronaut. Uri Geller was there. Hal Puthoff, who ran the remote viewing program with Russell Targ. They're taking a break during they're testing Uri for different things, and they go and they're having lunch, and Yuri's eating ice cream, and all of a sudden he suddenly cuts his lip. There's some metal thing in the ice cream, And he pulls this thing out, and he says, oh, look at this. And Edgar Mitchell immediately realizes this is part of a pin that he lost in Houston, Texas many years before. And he said, well, Uri's never been to Houston, Texas. So he picks up this pin, and he said, that's pretty weird. They go back to the lab, and they're in the lab. And so Edgar Mitchell and Hal Puthoff are in the lab, and all of a sudden they go, you hear this, and it's famous, tink. And you'll hear Apport people talk about it, tink. They hear this thing fall on the floor, and they look around, and they pick up the other half of the pin. And he just fell behind. Now, Uri's not in the room, and this thing falls, and then another pin falls later in the day. So when this metal thing started, I had this idea about, this whole idea that maybe this is just the phenomena trying to get our attention. And they're dropping this stuff, and you're going, like, what the hell's going on here? It's almost like a crop circle. Like, it's so weird. Like, what is going on? Like, why did they make this thing? How did they make this thing? How did this metal fall? And so I actually went to Hal Puthoff, and I said to Hal, all this stuff that's happening now, these metals and stuff, I said, are you looking at Apports or Apports? And he went, we're looking at the construction of the metal, one step at a time. Because he knows that this could be possibly connected to this thing. So we'll let them analyze the metal, and they're going to come, I think they're going to come to this dead end that's going to say, yeah, there's something weird going on here. But give you an example of some Apports. And I've actually got some audios of interviews that were done in the last couple of weeks where we're going to talk about this. So what happens at Skinwalker Ranch? It happens when they first buy the ranch. These people that buy the ranch, they go in there. The wife takes out she's got the groceries, she puts the groceries on the counter, takes all the groceries out of the bag, goes to the bathroom, comes back, and all the groceries are back in the bag. Now that's an Apport. It's an object that moves from one place to another. And the military is very interested in this, unfortunately, because this is key military technology. If you can actually just sort of pop into a room, move stuff into rooms, move stuff around, this is extreme. They're very interested, and that's why you see, if you hear the latest stories about the whole thing with the ATIP thing, with the ASAP, which is the main program. The main program was not to look at UFOs. The main program was to look at paranormal phenomena. The UFOs came later. The first thing was to go to Skinwalker Ranch. They determined that Skinwalker Ranch had these threat capabilities, and if we can figure out how all this bizarre stuff is happening at Skinwalker Ranch, we can militarize this sort of stuff. So what they did, that's how it starts, and then it moves to UFOs. The UFO money comes in later, because they have these bizarre reports. The other one that it has is the wife at Skinwalker Ranch goes and she's taking a shower. She locks the door to the bathroom, she's in the shower, she has the towel and the brush on the counter. She comes out of the shower, and the brush and the towel are gone. And later she finds the brush in the freezer. And this is usually what happens. These bizarre things where they hide it in a place where you're going to find it like a couple days later. It's almost like it's this trickster thing where they're playing. So these are the kind of things, these sort of things where things are being moved around. The other one that they had, where they tell the story where and this is where the mind plays into it. And this is where I keep saying, and the more I look at it, the more I think this is real. That when you start to think about something, you start to create something. You're part of the field. There is no separation. So what happens is, this rancher, all this bizarre stuff is happening, and they have these prize bulls, 4 prize bulls. And he goes, man, I hope they don't get the bulls. I mean, this is our entire life here, these 4 bulls, and they're separated in a corral. So he decides he's fearful, and he goes running out to look to make sure these bulls are okay, and of course the bulls are gone. And then he's looking around like, what happened to the bulls? And then he sees this trailer. And the trailer, the door is locked on this trailer, and there's spider webs and stuff, and has never been opened or whatever. And he looks, and then he decides to go and look, and he opens it up, and the 4 bulls are inside this trailer, stacked shoulder to shoulder, packed into this trailer. And as soon as he opens it, and he says, I found them, the bulls go crazy, and they sort of destroy the trailer and all this kind of stuff. So you see that he's playing into this, that he has this fear thing. And that's the whole thing that comes down to this Skinwalker Ranch thing. That the people that were at Skinwalker Ranch were military people. They were black ops people. They were walking around with guns. They had this idea that this could be a threat and this sort of thing. And I'll get into that later. Here's one with keys. This is a guy, this is where this weird stuff started about a week and a half ago. I come to the conference, and Paula Harris is there, and she says, oh, there's Tony guy, you gotta meet this Tony guy, he's got these photographs, and you gotta talk to this guy, he wants to talk to you. And I go, well, no, I'm not interested in photographs. And so it kept going. I said, okay, I'll talk to this guy. So then I says to Tony, I said, Tony, can we do an interview? Let's go up to the hotel room and I'll do an interview. I have no intention of looking at his photographs or anything, but I just want to, because I know he's an experiencer and has this bizarre sort of high-level thing, policy, you've got to talk to this guy. So for an hour and a half, I talked to him about all sorts of stuff, and I never looked at any photographs. Later, I'll look at his photographs, and he does have some weird photographs that I have here, but he has like helicopters, black helicopters. You always show the stories of black helicopters around people who've had experiences and something like that. He's got pictures of black helicopters like 50 feet over his head. Not up there, 50 feet over his head. I mean, you can almost see the guy in the helicopter, and then a UFO behind the helicopter. So he does have some very bizarre photographs. But here's him talking about, so I asked him, I'm into this Apport thing. All this stuff is happening with the Apports, with all these things. And so I say to him, I say, Tony, you ever have any weird stuff falling out of the sky and stuff like this? So here's him talking about his incident. It's actually his wife that starts it. This is a guy from Great Britain. And the key to his whole story is, here's a guy who only had sightings for a year and a half, who's a very, very sick guy, who'd never left Europe, had never been to a UFO conference, and suddenly got this thing got popped into his head that he's got to go to Laughlin, Nevada, across the other side of the world, and his wife is saying, you are totally crazy. You're not going, you've got a 10-year-old kid and a 12-year-old kid, you're sick, all these things, and so he has this idea he's coming to America. But, so I asked him, I say, okay, did you ever have any of these weird things? So here's him talking about the keys, and this is very famous. A lot of people describe this thing with the keys. No, you can't hear it. Yeah, I'll have to describe it. Okay, so he describes the keys. His wife says, suddenly these keys go flying through the kitchen. And so his wife, you gotta remember, his wife is sort of, she's seeing his photographs, but she's kind of skeptical of what he's doing. Then he has the one with his daughter, has this experience with the daughter where she suddenly says to him, I'm so-and-so. She mentions this Egyptian name and just goes, boom, falls on the floor. She's lying unconscious on the floor, and he goes to help her, and then she stands up like nothing happened and doesn't remember any of this kind of stuff. So he has that experience, and then he has the experience where he has his son. When his son is born, they find the son in the crib, and you have this plastic cover, and the kid is between the plastic cover and the mattress. And they're like, how did this kid ever get in there? And then I have this another one here. This is a guy from I interviewed. His name is Alien Protocol. So I said to him, I said, do you ever have any of these weird things? And he said, oh yeah. And he actually sent me a video. He actually wakes up his wife. It's kind of weird. He has one with an owl. It's an owl pin, where he's sitting there and this owl pin just falls. And it's an owl with sort of jewels embedded into it, whatever. And then he has this sort of a little toy thing that, like a little army guy that appears. And then he has this coin with a cross on it that appears. So he actually does a video, and if I had played, I'd play the video, where he's got his wife, and he says to his wife, okay, she's sleeping, and he says, I got, you see this, remember, you read this? Yeah, remember, yeah. She's confirming the fact, because he wanted to confirm that his wife was there when all these bizarre things sort of fell out of the sky. So we have him, and he tells me his story. Then we get to the conference, so I'm interviewing Tony. He tells me a story about the keys flying across. Then I lecture, and I talk about these Apports or Apports, and the fact that I've been fascinated, driven for the last couple of days with all these things, these Apport things. So I talk. Then Steve Mira, who runs Phenomena magazine in Great Britain, he stands up. And the point I was making in my presentation is, if you take a look at a lot of the UFO stuff, it matches paranormal phenomena. So in the early 20th century, everybody, now the big thing is to come to UFO conference, UFO meetings and stuff, and a lot of people, it's entertainment, they want to hear neat stories or whatever. In that period of time, it was seances. People were doing seances. They're contacting dead people. And during those things, coins were falling, stuff was appearing. It's the same thing. And that's where, when it comes to the consciousness thing, the world is two different things. Either the world is made out of little nuts and bolts, or it's made out of consciousness. If it's made out of little nuts and bolts, it's one world. If it's made out of consciousness, it's a completely different world. And the whole idea that I've come to, and a lot of people in the UFO community are now starting to accept, is that it's all the same thing. Ghosts, paranormal phenomena, psychics, mediums, UFOs, it's all the same. It's some sort of field, something coming out of a field, and it's all, we're parsing it. We're saying, like parapsychologists won't talk to UFO people won't talk to parapsychologists. Everybody's got their whole thing, and it's the whole idea that you're basically looking at the same thing, you just has a different mask on. So I give mine, and then Steve Mira stands up from Great Britain, and he starts talking about Apports. And he starts talking about the fact that it's connected, and to the medium, because he does a lot of ghost hunting, and he does a lot of, you know, talking to dead people, and with EVPs and all that kind of stuff. And he starts talking about it as well, and I did a long interview with him where they've actually analyzed, like, cups. So they'll have incidents where they've actually had a cup that has moved, and they actually are able to measure the temperature. And he says that the temperature of the object when it reappears at a certain position, and it's mathematical where it's going to reappear, it will appear, it's 12 to 15 degrees hotter than normal. It has to cool down. And that's the same thing with this piece that we discovered at the University of Arizona. It's the same thing. It was red hot when they first got it, and it had to cool down. So he did a lot of experiments with things, and he actually talks about a coin. So coins are big. And so he tells the coin story. He says, I'm walking along, and when the apport appears, it will fall on a floor where you can hear it. It goes this ting, where you go, what's going on? And you turn around, and you find this coin or whatever it is. And so he's walking through the living room, and it's very light-colored carpet, and he said it's right there. He said there's no way this thing was not there. It was there, and it was there, and it was actually the face facing you. Like it was actually, so you could see the head. It wasn't turned sideways or anything, and it's always heads up, always heads up. So he tells me this story about this coin, and he actually sold it. It was an American quarter that he sold for $160 on eBay. It was a coin that was a very rare coin that appeared on the middle of his floor in his house outside of London. So he tells this story, and then he actually goes through, they actually analyze the pieces, the cups, and they could see the structure of the cup had actually changed after it had reappeared. So he does this kind of stuff. So then he gives this lecture, and then I'm sitting there, and during UFO lectures, I always sort of fall asleep. So I'm falling asleep for the Navajo Rangers. And Navajo Rangers, and I'm sort of falling asleep, and all of a sudden I hear this. Oh, we had 64 coins, all heads up. 64 coins, all heads up. And the Navajo Rangers have these stories of these coins that are all landing heads up, 64 coins. And then they have the one with Charles Halt, who was the guy from Reynolds from Forest. He's there, and this coin hits his boot, and it's a 1 pound coin from the UK that appears beside his boot. So we have all these lectures. Suddenly, everybody's talking about these coins that are appearing. So I'm leaving the room, and the guy who works the door, if you've ever been to UFO Congress and all these places, he's always the same guy working the door. And he said, "Can I talk to you?" I go, "Yeah, you can talk to me." So he says, "I got a story about coins." And apparently, he said, I got it from Bob Brown. Bob Brown's got the same thing. Bob Brown has this thing with dimes, that these dimes appear, heads up. And so I said to him, I said, you got the same thing? He said, yeah, I got these dimes, they appear all the time. And he said, well, like, how many dimes have you got? He said, probably 40. And he tells me the story, he's got 40 dimes, all heads up. And then I remember, I work at Ronald Mcdonald House, I volunteer there. And I remember when one of the people that's permanently working there, she says to me one time, she says, oh, where were you? You weren't here last week. And I said, oh, I was lecturing. What that? I was lecturing. What are you lecturing? I said, UFOs. I got a story for you. I got this thing with dimes. And as soon as this guy told me this thing about dimes, and that Bob Brown had the dimes, I remember this woman, she says, I've had these dimes everywhere. They're all over the place. And she believes it's her mother talking. Her mother died, and her mother's leaving these dimes around, and they're always heads up. And so you get this bizarre thing with these apports. And Navajo Rangers, and then we're going to get to the weird. And then I talked to Andrea Perron, who was from the famous Conjuring movie, and now they're actually doing another movie. They're actually recreating the house on set. So she's very famous. Of course, I said to her, "Do you ever have any of these apport things?" And she goes, "Oh yeah, She sits down for 15 minutes, she's telling me all these stuff flying around, and the coins appearing and stuff like this. And I'm going like, wow, I'm onto something here. Like this is pretty bizarre, especially in terms of To the Stars working with this metal thing. I'm thinking, it's gotta have something to do with this metal thing, that this may not be UFOs falling apart. It may be something different where they're just dropping this kind of stuff. And there's a story about, it's called the Gold Leaf Lady. There's actually a study with a woman who could actually sit there and actually have gold leaf appear from her face, coming off her face. And they did a lot of investigation with her. So this is not that new. It's just I was not really aware of it. And then you get the connections where you tie it into the spiritualist stuff from the early 1900s. And one of the things that, and as I said, I've been in this a long time, most people now really don't know what angel hair is. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, angel hair, the UFO would fly, but sometimes it would drop the metal, but sometimes it would drop this, look like spider webs. And it would cover all the trees with all this like white spider web stuff all over the place. And people go, oh, and they would grab this stuff, but it would always dissolve. They almost couldn't get it to a lab fast enough to analyze it to find out what it was, because it would dissolve so fast. And if you look back in the mediums and the seance type stuff, when you look there, you see almost the same thing. This ectoplasm appearing, where this ectoplasm appears. And you go, is this the same thing? It's almost like it's a different mask, but it's the same sort of phenomenon. Now, here's the story that I say, if you don't think this is a weird story, it's time to stop coming to UFO meetings. This is the feather story. So anyway, I'm talking to Tony, and I says to Tony, I'm going through, and he's into the photographs and stuff. And the photographs are interesting in how it started. He had 2 sightings in 2018, and then in May of this year, suddenly it's there all the time. And he's photographing, there's helicopters and all this kind of stuff. And he realizes something's weird's going on, and he gets this idea in his head. So I say, why did you come? Like, you've never done a conference, you just had a couple of sightings, why did you come to Laughlin? He said, I just got this idea. I had to come and see you, and I had to come see Paula. And I wouldn't leave my mind. I just had to do it. And he said he and his wife were so debating about this. He said at one point he thought it might come down to a divorce. That he was going. I mean, he had to go. So I said, well, where did you get this? Where did you get this idea? And he said, it just was there. And then he starts telling the story. He says, I walk out and I'm thinking about this and I want to go. And he said, I walk out my patio door, and he says, this white feather comes down and lands right at his feet. Next day he walks out, white feather. Right at his feet. Third day, white feather, right at his feet. Fourth day he looks up, white feather, here it comes, down, lands at his feet, and he's going, this is a sign, I have to go to America. This is a sign. So he tells his wife, he says, there's these feathers, and these feathers are falling. And his wife says, Tony, there's feathers everywhere. So he goes out, he says, come on, I need a sign. Give me a sign that I should go. And he says, this time, there's a black feather, which is this big, in the sky, and it comes across, right above his head, and it sits there. And he goes, okay, thank you. And it goes like this, and it flies off into the sky. So he goes and tells his wife, he says, hey, I asked for a sign. And it actually, this black feather tells him, Tony, there's feathers everywhere. And they said, at this point, he said, I love you, dear, but this is serious stuff. I have to go to America. And so she had seen his photographs. So she knew he wasn't crazy. She'd seen these photographs. And like most people, like partners in the UFO business, the partner's really not into it. So, but she's sort of supporting whatever. So she decides he's done this manifestation thing. So next day, he has this sort of confrontation. He says, I've got to go. And he actually had actually rented the hotel already. He'd actually signed up. He hadn't bought the ticket for the plane yet. So she's sitting there, and then she goes, okay, I'll play with you. So she's going to, they live outside of London. He's on disability. He's actually very sick. He's outside of London, so she gets on the train to go into London. She's sort of a big executive there. And she walks out, and she says, okay, show me the feather. So